Hello, Biblionauts, errands of the Biblioverse. I am here today to bring you a very special tag, a tag in translation, the War and Peace tag, because this book has been looming around BookTube for quite a while now, a couple of months. I feel like this specific corner of BookTube has being like everyone has been reading War and Peace or is reading War and Peace. Maybe you read it before in the group chat in Boxer, or even before that already people was reading it, or maybe you're reading it now with like Joe Spivey. But so many people is reading this reading War and Peace. So I'm like, okay, let's make a homage not only to War and Peace but also to one of my favorite booktube communities, which is one that you probably don't have access to, which is the Spanish booktube community, which is a beautiful, really nice, thriving booktube community that shares many facets of this one, in sense of the lack of fakeness, or like there's many other booktube communities in the English YouTube, and most of them are just like marketing. They are not formed by readers. that's the best way to put it. But in this specific corner, with like about a few hundred booktubers, that is not the case. This is people who reads and is very honest, and they just talk about the things that they like, and they actually have real conversations about the books. They don't talk about like some abstract concepts that allow them not to talk about the thing that is on the book, so that they don't have to show that they actually haven't read the book. I'm sorry, this was not supposed to be a rant. Let's forget about that. This homage is not only to War and Peace, but also to BookTube Spain, which is wonderful, because this is not my tag. This is a tag in translation. This is a tag that I translated from a YouTube channel called Magrata Hostiernos. I'll link her video on the description, or just in case you are able to understand Spanish. But I'll just go for it. It's based on characters of War and Peace, so it's a character-based tag with premises for each character that you sort of like have to talk about a book for that somehow resembles that character. But you don't have to have read War and Peace, and I want to stress that, because I probably will not tag a lot of people who read War and Peace this year, because I'm assuming that people who read War and Peace is more likely to want to do this tag anyways, and I wanted to tag some new people. But I'm also gonna tag some very old, very old people, some Jurassic people in this tag. So yeah, without any more, without further ado, let's start. And the first premise, of course, has to be Pierre Bezukhov. And for Pierre, we have a book that came to you by chance and unexpectedly became one of your favorites. And I have a number of books that I came to me by chance, not only unexpectedly, but I expected them to be shit, and they were not. Firstly, Candide from Voltaire was the case. When I knew the premise of Candide before reading Candide, and I was like, really, am I gonna waste my time with such a simple premise? But it's Voltaire, and Voltaire was one of the which many of you will be very happy, since I know that in BookTube quite a few people doesn't like philosophy. Don't. But it's probably the book that made me turn from reading philosophy to wanting to read more literature, because Voltaire is right in between. Voltaire, we study Voltaire in philosophy, but many people read Voltaire for many other reasons. So yeah, that will be one. Candide was super fun. It's super short. It's super enjoyable, and it's very well written. So highly recommended. Anyways, then there is a very philosophical book. It's Time and Necessity: A Question on Human Belief by Saul Kripke. And it's a book about like meaning and identity, the identity of naming, how like names and the identity that those names carry might change through time. Like the meaning of that identity might change, and yet the thing itself doesn't change. Like you can, I think there's an example that he gives with a bridge in London, but just like think of the city itself, right? Like what we call London today is nothing, like that has nothing to do with the city 200 years ago, right? And yet it somehow it preserves its identity. So that's what Salt Creek is looking at. And this is a book I was ready to hate because I have studied philosophy in the UK. I have encountered a lot of analytic philosophy, and analytic philosophers tend to me to be the worst, the most boring, the most enjoyable philosophers of them all. But and this was also like in one of my least favorite classes, which was epistemology, and I genuinely I wasn't even gonna do a reading in the first place, but then I was assigned to read a chapter of this book, and I read the whole book because it was so like it's just very good philosophy. It's just very interesting, very good philosophy, and as analytic as it is, it still feels like it has a more far-reaching argument to make that is more applicable than other things in analytic philosophy, where it feels like it's just mere semantics that they are arguing about. Finally, and this I'm gonna struggle to pronounce, is even to file Hayan, even Jackson, something like that. It's an Oxford classic that came out a few years ago, and I read it like pretty much immediately, because it was before going into university. I read the reading lists of 5 or so universities, and of course I chose those universities that I thought in the moment. At the time I thought, silly me, I thought that, universities like Oxford would have like a greater like a better reading list, or like they would take you a bit further than other universities, which is not true. I have handed out and discussed the philosophy and other topics with Oxford students, with Cambridge students, with UCL students, with LSE students, and I can tell you that the number one rule, like the almost invariable rule, is that none of them reads, and most of them are just like completely ignorant of the topic that they are studying. And this applies also to master's students. If you read about any subject, you are more than likely to know more about that subject than an undergraduate or postgraduate student of any of those subjects, because being in university somehow doesn't mean that you have to know about the thing that you're studying. No, not anymore. You can go through a whole degree without even like sitting down and looking at a book, at the book cover of one of the books that you're supposed to be examined for. Yeah, that is just true. Is a self-evident fact, and if you don't believe me, just like when it comes to philosophy, just go to a symposium. If you have read 2 books on philosophy, go to any of the many open symposiums that all philosophy societies have, and just listen to people talk, and tell me that it doesn't look like, if you went into like the countryside and got like a bunch of people who like have never read a book and maybe like work, have a full-time job and don't even think about philosophy, and present them with a philosophical question, they would be able to think more about those questions than students today. So yeah, finito. However, even Tufail, Hayan, Ibn Jackson, and some of the books on the reading lists of those universities, which probably I was the only person, silly me again, to read those reading lists, was amazing. It was an amazing book. It was written in the Arabic Spain, Al-Andalus, back in the days, and the way that they would write, it was like it had a didactic purpose. Like even Tufail had like multiple goals in writing this story. He wanted to teach Islam, but he wanted to teach medicine. He wanted to teach philosophy. He wanted to teach many things that were considered all like an all-encompassing science. We forget that words like philosophy before contained everything, like every other discipline of study of the world that we have today comes from philosophy. And philosophy itself, is in some ways a derivation and emancipation of theological discussions that preceded. So yeah, that was an incredible book to read. It's about a kid that is generated in an island, in a desert island, and grows alone. And this kid interacts with the universe, and then the prophet comes, and then he sees Allah, and a bunch of things. But which was very that part in which the book actually kind of describes the vision that he has of like what would be God, is very polemic, and I imagine that it gave him a lot of problems back in the day, because you are not supposed to, even in Christianity, you are not supposed to create an image of your God, although in Christianity is constantly ignore that specific commandment. But yeah, I think it's an amazing book to read. This kid, they have many theories of how it came out, how it was generated into the island. My favorite one was that he came through like a crack on the ground in a bubble of like lava or something like that. And then, he was raised by a deer, and then the deer has like a sickness, for example, and the deer is dying, and he opens the deer to cure her illness. And this is the way that Tufail has of teaching you how to do medicine, how to like cure certain kind of disease. So yeah, amazing book, super recommended. Did not expect to enjoy that book. I was like ready for like a hardcore reading list, and struggle to like confront like whatever mega academic super dry literature. And that was like a really 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 interesting, really fun book to read, especially as a not even first year student yet. Then we have second premise. This is gonna take a while, isn't it? Natasha Rostova, a book with a bad start, but that through the reading improves until you love it. And for this, I had to say War and Peace, because I hated the first 200 pages of War and Peace. Now, retrospectively, I don't hate them. I actually love the book, but War and Peace for me is one of those books that it really gets better all the way to the first epilogue. And then we forget about the second epilogue. It's not that I didn't like it. I do have a sweet tooth for philosophy, even when it becomes repetitive and wrong. But still, I think that War and Peace is a crescendo up to the first epilogue. Next premise is Andrei Bolkonski, and you can see how these premises are sort of like matching the characters. Now, because the premise is telling you how the character is, you don't have to have read, you don't have to know who the next guy is, Andrei Bolkonski. But because the premise tells you a book that plunges you into despair. And books don't tend to plunge me into despair. I understand what you mean. Like, there's a movie that is one of my favorite movies, which is Synagogue in New York by Charlie Kaufman. I had a massive Kaufman phase that is very depressing, and probably is one of the very few things that ever depressed me. Ideas in the past, as I was growing up, I was confronted with ideas very quickly, but as I was growing up, realizing of like the numbers of injustices and it's just not quantifiable sense definitely became something that was depressing. There's a documentary that I recommended, I think everyone should watch, which is called Earthlings, which is about like, the different categories of speciesism, animal abuse that we as a species do towards other species, basically. And is like, just to quantifiably know the degree of suffering that we inflict on other species, completely unjustified and unnecessary, is enough argument to know that, like, in a utilitarian sense, it's enough suffering to completely annihilate any argument for the continuation of our species. Like, it's not worth it. We as a species are not worth it. We are not worth the cost of our existence. But those realizations were a long time ago, and nothing plunges me into despair now. The most recent book that plunged me into despair was, for a completely different reason, was Anthony Kenny's History of Philosophy, which is like probably the longest book I've read, 50-50 with War and Peace, and is a history of Western philosophy, basically. It's a very good book. It's divided between like history of philosophers and history of their ideas, which is a really good way to go, because it's much more it feels more complete and more approachable than Bertrand Russell's, which I also read. But the problem with this one was that I I sat down and I was like, okay, I'm gonna read this before starting my foundation year back in the days as well. And it was because I was fluent speaking English, but I was fluent speaking English because I am a survivor. I've traveled, I've moved around, I grew up what you would call a white trash. I had no prospect. Not once did I pass one exam of English language in school. Not once. No one ever thought I was gonna learn English. But that's only because I never saw why I needed it. Anytime I need something, I got it. And the moment I started needing English, I learned English and I spoke it. But that was working. So I had my language was very limited towards the context of work, and then of course the context of like hanging out in different countries and speaking broken English with other people who doesn't also speak English, like as their mother tongue. So I was very scared about one, my familiarity with philosophy, and two, most importantly, my unfamiliarity with academic English. So I was like, okay, if I start this book and I read the whole book before starting uni, then I'll probably be okay. And it was the case. It was more than okay. By far, I was the most well-read on the topic on the subject of philosophy person on my course by far. But it plunged me into despair because it was worse than learning to read again. I would not. The only thing I can compare it to is subvocalizing. When I try not to subvocalize, I can't remember what I'm reading. But this was harder because I actually pushed through. I didn't give up on the first 2 minutes as I'm doing with subvocalizing, which I haven't yet taken it seriously and trying to stop subvocalizing. But with this, I did, and it was so alienating going from knowing how to read and feeling like I'm a relatively smart person to feeling genuinely thinking that I have some kind of disability, not being able to process page after page after page and just pushing through and I have to read 100 pages today. I have to read 100 pages today. And for 100 pages being it's just not getting here. It was so hard for me to get the part of my brain to work that would make me understand the words in the page. Even though when I understood every single one of them individually, they just wouldn't come through. And I even sometimes I would have to read aloud. I would read 100 pages aloud so that they would get through. And yeah, that was just it's the book that's made me cry the most, and it's that had nothing to do with the book itself. It's just it was so hard. So for me, it was super, super, super hard. So yeah, that's definitely a book that definitely plunged me into despair in many ways. But I'm incredibly glad I read it. I also feel only with that book, it already gave me so much perspective on the whole subject. So yeah, that's number 3. Number 4, Marya Bolkonski, and that's the book you have gifted or recommended the most, and that would be also by far probably The Perfume by Patrick Susskind. It's probably the first book I ever called my favorite book at least in the last few years. Oh, I just lost all my notes. It's because the phone is gonna turn off and I'm afraid that might happen and I don't want it to happen, so I was putting everything in place. Yeah, okay, there you go. No, alright. Physics. I don't know if you heard about the law of gravity, but it's something that sometimes is reminded to me, to my dislike. But yeah, I'll have to hold the notes. So yeah, about The Perfume by Patrick Susskind is an amazing book. In retrospective, I not only did I love that book, but I feel like I give it to people for the same reasons that people tend to give The Picture of Dorian Gray. I consider The Perfume to be much better as a book, but also in the sense that it's so different that it also, while being good as an introduction to reading literature, to someone who hasn't read a novel and wants to read a novel, I feel like it's a really good book to read first, because you are reading something relatively obscure in the sense that it's not a super friendly, super easy book to read, but also so it's simple because it's just it's a, like the story about like someone who kills, and like serial killers we've read many stories about. Just reading this sort of like Victorian style, but the reason why this person kills and the facets and the personality of this main character is so weird that it also shows you like what literature can do, like the stories that can be told, and it's something that cannot be predicted all the way to its end, which is like one of the most apotheosic climaxes of the history of literature for me. So I'm always like, for a specific kind of friend, but I have many of those specific kind of friends, is the number one book I give them, because I know that like if they finish it, they will be like, wow, like they will want more of this. Well, if I give them some older book that might be very well written, but it's gonna be exactly what they thought a book would be, it doesn't break their expectations as much as this one will do, then they might finish and be like, okay, yeah, now I've read a book. So yeah, Perfume by Patrick Susskind, a great book, and for a while it was my favorite book. Nikolai Rostov, a character, this is number 5. Nikolai Rostov, a character that you loved and hated at the same time. And I could have said Grenouille from the Perfume, but because I didn't want to repeat myself, I said another character which is probably one of my favorite characters in the history of literature and most hated, and that's Ahab from Moby Dick. This character is I hate this character because he makes Moby Dick a tragedy. He's the most like tragic romantic character there is. Like he's seeking revenge, trying to kill this whale, this monster of the seas, and dragging everyone with him without really telling them what he's actually doing. And you're gonna hate him because of all of that, but you understand the character so well, and the character has this amazing charisma and purely like beautifully designed hatred that it's just like I love this character. I am waiting for the day that Steve finally writes a novel with the backstory of Ahab, because he's always saying that he will. And I would totally read that book. I think Ahab is an amazing character, and yes, I hate Ahab and I love Ahab, and it's one of those characters that like I will always remember. And now we go into number 6, and it's already 22 minutes. I really hope this can be finished before 30, but I don't know. I don't trust myself. I'm enjoying this way too much. Number 6 is Mikhail Kutuzov, an unpopular book that you love. And I mean, I could say Spanish authors like Los Pereiro or San Cristan, which I consider him to be not as long as he should be. But I haven't read in Spanish authors for so many years now. I haven't read in Spanish and a Spanish author for so long that I'll probably do like 2025 will be my Spanish literature reading, because it's been so long. I haven't been in Spain, like living in Spain for like the past 10 years, and that means that I haven't had like direct access to books in Spanish and the authors I actually want and the editions I actually want for quite a while. So I'm gonna say 2 books which are among my favorite books of all time, and one is Minimum Moralia by Theodor Adorno, which, if I had it, but I don't think I have it. If I had it, I would read the passage. But Minimum Moralia is a book written in exile. Is meant to be a polemical book. It's not a philosophical book. Theodor Adorno wrote his magnum opus along with Horkheimer's magnum opus, which is The Dialectic of Enlightenment, which is an incredible book. But Minima Moralia is not concerned with arguments, it's not concerned with convincing you of a thesis, is, as it says in the subtitle, Reflections from a Damaged Life. And his reflections of like his socio-economical background and the things that he sees in the world, and how like mass production has destroyed certain things, certain parts of the beauty of a social life, and talks about homelessness, and talks about capitalism, of course, and talks about like exile and fascism, and about like many of the many like dark sides of our society, of our comforts, of our privileges, and what a commodity really is, and all of these things. In not being concerned, he also talks about literature, about Proust, talks about everything. It's just aphorisms. It's just series of reflections, and that have an overarching narrative, which is a critique of the world as a whole, a critique of the 20th century world, which um, goes all the way to our days. And because he's not trying to make an argument and be philosophical, it doesn't feel as dry as other literature. You can feel the hatred through the lines, although he is a critical theorist. It still feels like, it's not an easy book to read. It has references and words and ways of framing sentences that might not be what you're looking for if you are only into canonical classics. But I highly recommend it. I think it's an incredible book, and some of the aphorisms is just some light sparks behind your head when you read them. And as a person with a lot of experience with all of those hard realities of the world, for my age, but in terms of working illegally in as an illegal immigrant in other countries. I'm legal here, but I've had I've had my history with seeing with homelessness, with being in the wrong place in Mexico or in Serbia, and I've seen this from many different angles. So my pessimism when it comes to our system and how we have chosen to organize our societies, I consider it to be relatively justified in my own sort of experiential evidence. I know anecdotal evidence after all, which can be fallacious, can be biased. But for me, that book is just it's unpopular. No one talks about this book from Adorno, I think, compared to other books. But it's incredible. And then another popular author in his genre, but a book of his that not so many people talks about, that I haven't heard by anyone other than me, being talked about in booktube, and that is Albert Camus. And Albert Camus used to be my favorite philosopher. He used to be my favorite writer. I probably have read I'm not all Camus, because I'm sure there is something I haven't read. But Caligula, his play, is my favorite play of all time, and he's much better at representing absurdism than any of his theses. Caligula is an incredible play. It's an amazing play. I think you should all read it, because I don't know that there is a place to watch it. I have watched it in Spanish, but I don't know if there is an English play available. Maybe here in YouTube, potentially there is, but it's just amazing. And of course, it takes the figure Caligula, and it flirts with the thesis that Caligula really understood that absurdism and really understood the absurd, and that's why he had this crazy behavior that is completely psychopathic. And I would say that you will at the end of the book, it's not like you will understand Caligula, but you might be there's another character, which is the one that is the main enemy of Caligula, the one that confronts him, who also understands the absurd. And I think it's the best way to understand absurdism from a sort of two-side viewpoint, without ending on the side of oh, I'm an absurdist now, so nothing matters, so I'm just gonna fuck my neighbor or something. I don't know. It's just my favorite Albert Camus. I highly recommend it. It's super enjoyable. It's very poetic. It's the most poetic thing that Camus ever wrote, in my opinion. And again, it presents his philosophical thesis better than anything else that I've seen from him as well. What are we now? Yeah, the Kuragins, a book with a beautiful cover that is disappointing to read. And that was this. I was so excited to read these poems by Maria Stepanova. And even the title sounded like I was ready for this to become one of my favorite poetry books, basically. But I find Russian poetry to always be, it just doesn't get through the page. I just cannot reach the beauty or the poetic value of the poems. Sometimes the meaning in the sentences is good, but poetry is not so much about meaning, it's not so much about content as it is about form. And because of that, I was very disappointed about that book. I think he's probably a good poet, but I think that Russian is a very tricky language to translate, especially when it's in verse. And I think that's probably why that book didn't, like, it just passed me by. I couldn't care less about the book. It honestly, like, didn't like a single poem in the whole book. And I always say that even the worst poet has a good poem, and even the best poet has a bad poem. It's a rule. It's like another physical law of the universe that has always been true for me. What else? A gossipy book, and all Victorian novels, really. I don't know what to tell you. Like, all Victorian novels are gossipy. Anna Karenina, it's the one that comes to mind among those that I have read, because I don't know. I'd say, yeah, Anna Karenina or any Victorian novel. Dickens is not so gossipy. Jane Austen books are gossipy, but I never finished a book from Jane Austen, so I don't want to say that. I don't want to categorize any of her books yet, because I will eventually give her the chance again. Although it's not the kind of topic in literature that tends to really that I tend to really love. Number 10, favorite villain. And this one, I could have thought of like 1,000 different villains, because villains are a good villain tends to always be my favorite character in a book. And this is an exception, because although this is my favorite villain in the history of literature, it also has one of my favorite characters in the history of literature. And this is a book that when I read it, when I just finished and made a video, I was like, maybe I wasn't as emphatic as I would have been on how I loved it, because I was working and doing a self-instructor course and a sailing course at the same time I was reading this, and I didn't have a lot of I was not like fully involved. And I think this is one of those books that I would like to pick up again in winter, in one of those moments when like I am genuinely just reading, because I'm missing out a lot in a lot of my favorite books that I've read recently, just because I'm doing so much stuff. And this book deserves so much more than what I gave it, and that's The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco. Umberto Eco is an amazing writer, and The Name of the Rose is is a murder mystery, and it's an incredible murder mystery. And there's a villain that, if I tell you the name of the villain, I'm spoiling a lot of this book. I know most people doesn't care about spoilers anymore. I think we've emancipated as a society in the last couple of days from that. But if we have not, I'm just gonna warn you. I'm gonna say the name right now, so maybe move 5 seconds ahead if you are planning to read this book and you don't want to know who's the villain, meaning who's the one who is behind those murders, and that is Jorge de Burgos. And this character created and based so much in Borges, in my opinion. I was just imagining Borges when I was reading the book, and it also has a really good movie adaptation that I also loved and I watched way before I read the book. The Name of the Rose is amazing. It's packed with philosophy and with history and with theology, and none of those things feels out of place. With other writers that write novels generally and are not philosophers, it tends to feel like, it happened to me with War and Peace, for example. It tends to feel like, yeah, you're really fascinated on this topic, but still it's very clear to me that you are not a theologist or a philosopher or anything like that, because sometimes those subjects escape you. Your own flaws are like so visible to me, and you're not even able to see them, and also they don't really fit the narrative. In here, every discussion is for the betterment of the book. This is a dense book. It's reflective. but it also has an amazing story, very well put together, and with a really nice plot twist and a beautiful ending. I honestly, I don't think there's anything about this book that I don't like at the moment. I it's not among my favorites only because I feel like I missed so much of it. But I feel like if I reread this book, it could very much become one of my favorite books. Because every time I come across something on this book that I cannot quite make heads or tails of, it's almost always because of my own limitations when it comes to the way I read it and everything. So yeah, Jorge de Burgos, amazing villain, and incredible story. And finally, last but not least, Platoon Karataev, a book that make you look, I forgot to say about gossipy book. I actually can think of a kind of book that is gossipy that I actually like reading. Is Correspondences. There is in Spanish an edition of a book, a correspondence between Heidegger and Hannah Arendt. When I read that correspondence like that, I always feel like it couldn't be more gossipy than that. But it's Heidegger and Hannah Arendt writing, like their own sort of like philosophical love letters, and I think that's definitely a gossipy book that I recommend. Back to number last 11, Platoon Karataev, a book that made you reconsider your life or a specific aspect of it. Now, I am very aware of every single aspect of my life, and in the past decade, I could not think of a single book that has changed like my life, in the sense of like, everything is like, what Ralph Waldo Emerson says in the Confidence in Oneself, like I don't remember the books I have read, but they have changed me. Sure, everything changes you. Every person I've met has changed me in some way. Every book I have read, or most of them, have changed me in some way. My favorite books have certainly changed me in some way. But like a proper shock that requires a systematic reconsideration of how I behave and my life, or how I think, or something like that. Not really. However, I have a couple of books that have that potential, and that could have, if they were the first iterations of a certain idea that they have, that I would have encountered, they would certainly have changed the way I see things, or the way I think, or my life in some way. I have two books. Actually, I have three books. Actually, the three books in some ways have changed. Something about, like, because they are like the best, the most polished representation of those ideas that have the potential of changing the scope of your life, or how you think, or something like that. But those ideas I was already familiar with, and I had already begun to change the way I think before, because I was already informed basically on the things they are informing you on. So I was already a vegan when I read Animal Liberation from Peter Singer, for example, which is an incredible book. And if you agree with the next statement, things can be true or can be wrong, right? If you are living based on wrong premises and you realize that you're wrong about something, you would change that. If someone tells you that the sky is red, and they actually demonstrate to you with clear logic that you've been calling the color blue red your whole life, and therefore the sky is red, or something like that. That's not a very good example, but what I mean is, like, if you agree that if you are willing to change your mind, if you are genuinely open-minded about a topic, and you're able to go confront it and willing to let it change you, if you find out that the arguments that this book presents are correct and you were wrong, and you have been wrong all along, and not only that, but that you agree with the book, with the premises it presents, the book is just showing you how you already believe in anti-speciesism, how you are already agreeing with the concepts and the ideas presented in animal liberation, and you were just ignoring them actively, doing a very lazy, intellectually lazy exercise throughout your life. If you are willing to do that, then open Animal Liberation, read it cover to cover, and then come back to me and tell me that you don't have to become a vegan, and tell me that you don't have to become an anti-speciesist, which is not to say an activist or anything like that. It means just to stop taking part in a socially agreed to ignore mass genocide that is happening every single day. I think Animal Liberation is probably the best presentation of this of this reality, because it uses arguments as unlike other books that are just throwing numbers at you. This book is just basically showing you how the arguments that you use to justify meat consumption don't justify it, don't work. Why they don't work? Why, if you were to agree with them, you would have to agree with like eating humans as well? Why, if you don't agree with eating humans and you don't want to be a theologian and say that, like, you know, humans have like some higher essence and it's just their race, but you're actually saying no, we are different, right? And therefore we have a higher morality, a higher stance, a higher right or dignity. Whatever argument you have is completely demolished in this book. It's shown that all your arguments against meat consumption, for meat consumption, for the consumption of animal products, are actually arguments against it. And if you finish the book and you think that you have any argument for that, come to me. We can even make a live. I will destroy every single argument that you have. I have read about this subject. I have thought about this subject more than any other. And it's just the case that the only argument that would work, that would let you get away with this without being intellectually lazy, is I don't give a fuck about animal suffering or about others in general. I pick and choose. You know, if someone is dying next to me and I don't want to help them, I just don't help them, and I don't consider that to be bad because I don't acknowledge morality. If you negate morality, then we just cannot have any conversation at all anyways. If you escape morality as a whole, if you don't agree with the moral rules that we have sort of like created over millennia, then I didn't want this to become like a political speech, a political meeting, but you are right, then you can keep doing it. But if that is not the case, then there is something there that needs deep investigation. The next book is, so just to go into a more loose subject before we get into another heavy subject, is Superfunctional Training and Beyond. And now I have, there's many different brands of training. There's movement training, there is superfunctional training, there is, hybrid athletes. And they are trying to get at the same idea, which is something that I've naturally always done, which is to train in ways that apply to the real world, to have a very polymath or jack of all trades, however you want to see it, approach to physical training, right? To try to train in the way that you are naturally meant to move, and to not look so much for like lifting heavier weights in the gym, but acquiring new movement patterns and lifting weights or doing exercises in ways that will apply to the real world. I am an extremely agile person. I did martial arts for 10 years before living in Spain as a kid. From like I grew up doing sports in general anyways, but I did martial arts, I did swimming, I did rowing. In martial arts I mean a lot of them. I did Kung Fu specifically for 10 years, but while I was doing that I did Krav Maga, I did Taekwondo, I did Karate. So I naturally, like, whenever I get interested in a new subject, I train for it at the moment that, like, the next thing I want to try to learn is to dance, which is something that I just don't know how to do. So that is basically the idea of movement training, of all of these things, is to just like, become as versatile as you can in the way you use your body, and capable, therefore. And it's life-changing in so many ways. to understand the reasons why you should do it and to do it, as opposed to just go to the gym and look at yourself in the mirror where you lift one weight in one way that is going to make you less mobile and less overall strong than than this kind of training can do. Is probably the most life-changing thing in terms of your individual personal life. And last but not least is I think the translation, because this I read in a PDF on its original language, which is Spanish, is A Critical World History by Enrique Dussel, Politics of Liberation. And this is a perspective of a world history that its main approach is to remove Europe from the center of the action, is to show how the West, what we call the West, for most of history has been one of the most irrelevant parts of the of world trade, of philosophy, of society in general. So it's giving voice to many parts of more, like, to all. Every time you read a world history and you feel like this, I feel like there's a continent that someone didn't talk about here, or I feel like, there's a couple of subjects that they are systematically ignored in other world histories. Well, that is what this world history is about. It's about those things that we as sort of like Westerners have ignored, and about how in ignoring them, we have actually ignored probably like the center, right? His idea, for example, is that like the true center of the world for most of history, and therefore, we call Asia the East and America the West, because we have this idea of Europe being the center. But the real center throughout most of history has been the Middle East. And because there were like trade routes made all the way from like West Africa to East Asia, and they were really at the heart of most like human civilizations and social life and everything. So it's very, very interesting. It's incredibly eye-opening. And it's, of course, like every other one-volume world history, is a world history to read along with many others, and then contrast, and you get your own idea. But I found it, like, for me, it was just something I had never encountered. I encountered his lectures first, and that's why when I got to the world history, the book itself didn't like change my mind so much, because I had already been sort of like surprised by his lectures. But yeah, that's it. Politics of Liberation, A Critical World History by Enrique Dussel. I highly recommend that book as well. Everything I've mentioned here today are books that I love, and I've tried to talk about books. I don't have most books with me, that's why I tend to repeat myself in previous videos, because I like holding a book. But this time I just try to talk about books that, even though I don't have here with me, because I'm making a massive move. As you can see, all the books on wrapped in newspapers, because I'm leaving. Once again, I live in a constant state of departure and never really arriving anywhere. But yeah, that's it. This is the tag. I hope you like the tag, and I'm gonna tag a bunch of people, and also those that I have not tagged. Maybe I have tagged you 1,000 times, so I'm not tagging you again, because you know, by this point, it should be sort of like, just take it for granted that you're tagging everything. If I tag you more than twice, then just take it for granted that you are tagged. I'm tagging you every single time. So probably I want you to do a video for this as well, right? But I'm gonna tag still. I'm gonna repeat myself again, but I'm gonna tag a bunch of people. I'm tagging first that reading guy, which is a relatively new booktube channel. We talk a lot about a lot in the comments very often, and somehow I had never realized that he actually also makes videos. So I watched his channel recently, and I like to see what he has to say about these questions. Then I want to tag Michael K. Bogan, because it's been a while since I tagged him, and I feel like this is a kind of tag for whom, like, the titles that he would be coming up with would be very interesting and different from the kind of titles that I can think of. So I'm definitely looking forward to that. And for the same reasons, I'm also tagging Criminoli. I think Criminoli didn't finish War and Peace. I have on my list to watch later his video on why he didn't, but I definitely wanna see why. And yeah, so I'm tagging Criminoli. I'm tagging Aaron Facer, as Aaron Facer did read War and Peace, and I'm also curious about, like, if he agrees with the associations of characters here. I'm tagging Joe Spivey because he's reading at the moment War and Peace. I'm like, maybe, you know, maybe he'll finish it. I think he will definitely finish it. He is unstoppable when it comes to reading big books, I think, or at least it gives me that impression. I'm tagging as well big hard books and classics. And what else? I'm also tagging History Elite, which is another channel that is also relatively new, and I've talked to him a couple of times as well. And I'm tagging as well to Readers in My Concern, which is another channel that I discovered recently, also relatively new, and yeah, and he just made another a response to the video of books that you don't have to read, but I will. So that's consider yourself tagged, and of course, you know, all people that I always tag in this channel. Steve Donaghy, the oldest of our tagged persons, and I say that because he always calls me the young Greek, so it's just a revenge kind of thing. And I'm tagging Dave Novak as well, and I'm sure I'm forgetting a bunch of people. Yeah, because I basically didn't have more space on the page to write, so that's where I decided to stop tagging people. But I could continue. If the page was longer, I would continue tagging people because I actually want you all to do this tag. And with that, I'm now going. I have a day off after a week of. You've probably seen videos throughout the week, but they were recorded on my previous day of the last week. And this will probably be posted on the week after, on the next day off. After a week of working from 10 a.m. to 12 a.m. So forgive me if you don't see me, but that is gonna become increasingly more and more the case. I'll make a video talking about that because I have a very eventful, I'm gonna have a very eventful few months, and I'll still try to find these small compartments of time in which I can reach out and be like, hey, I exist. And I have this book to talk about or something like that. But yeah, I mean, without further ado, I'll see you on the other side. Take care, BookTube.